Hi, my name is Logan Telles. I'm with the City of Eugene, and I'm going to be giving a presentation on transportation project, though I'm not sure exactly where that is in the agenda. So Kate, you'll have to let me know when I'm up.
You're up.
Okay, great. I should just launch right into it.
Yeah, I think we're ready for you.
All right, fantastic. Let me share my screen. And I'll give you a heads up. I can hear you. I'm having a slightly difficult time understanding what's coming from the room. So when it comes to questions, Kate, I may need assistance in understanding what you all are saying.
Okay, if you hold on 1 second. What we found out last month is that if you don't come up and talk directly into this microphone thing in the middle of the room, they can't hear you. So you can choose to stay in your seat and we'll restate your questions, or you can choose to come up and present your questions to the all-seeing technological device, and then they'll be able to hear us as well. Thanks.
All right, fantastic. Well, with that, I'll go ahead and get started. As I said, my name is Logan Telles. I'm a transportation planner with the City of Eugene, and I'm going to be talking today about some upcoming work that we have planned for Hunsaker Lane. So I'm going to cover a few things today, including what the city's upcoming project entails, and we're going to talk through some of the outstanding design considerations that we're going to be working through as we start working on our engineering drawings for the project. So to start, for anyone who doesn't know, the City of Eugene has a project planned for Hunsaker Lane from approximately River Road down to Tato. We received around a $1.5 million grant award to help us construct this project. And really what the project entails, where our starting point is the conceptual design that came out of the Beaver Hunsaker corridor planning process. So as some of you may remember, Lane County, who currently owns and maintains Hunsaker Lane, went through a planning process several years ago that included a lot of community engagement and a lot of technical analysis to come up with design recommendations for both Hunsaker Lane and Beaver. And so the Hunsaker portion of the planning process identified this image you see here as the preferred conceptual design for the corridor by the community. So as you can see in this visual here, that includes 10-foot general travel lanes. That includes buffered bike lanes. And for anyone who isn't familiar with that term, what I mean by buffered bike lanes is you would have a 5-foot standard bike lane and then a 2-foot painted buffer, just to give a bit of extra distance from cyclists and vehicles. That extra painted buffer just helps when it comes to separating the bike lane from the general traffic just a bit better. The conceptual design also includes 4-foot landscaping planters and 5-foot sidewalks. So this, as I mentioned before, was kind of our starting point. When the Beaver Hunsaker corridor planning process wrapped up, at that point, the question was, all right, there's this community preferred design. How do we fund building it? And so Lane County and the City of Eugene have kind of worked together in the instance of Hunsaker. I know it's not generally typical to see the city construct a transportation project on a county-owned street, but in this instance, we decided to jump in and take this portion of the corridor and construct these improvements. And then, as some of you are aware, Lane County constructed improvements on the portion of Hunsaker further down from Tato, so that's something that they've performed some work on at this point. And so the idea is the county's work in tandem with the city's work will create, kind of continuous transportation improvements that are just going to help Hunsaker feel more comfortable and safer for folks who, I mean, really for everyone, but particularly those who are walking and biking. So at this point in the process, as I mentioned, we've gotten funding, we have the conceptual design. And what we're really doing now is we're looking for community feedback on some outstanding design considerations that we're going to need to work through and refine as we develop the detailed engineering drawings that will eventually enable us to go put out the project for construction companies to bid on and actually get the project installed. So some of the design considerations we're working through right now include, one, how we're handling spatially constrained locations where there is less right-of-way width. Two, how we handle vehicle speeds, because we've heard a lot of concerns from community members about vehicle speeds on Hunsaker. And we're also thinking through the subject of how we improve crossing conditions, and what we can do to facilitate the most comfortable and safe pedestrian crossing conditions that we can. So first, let's talk about spatial constraints. So I want to start this section of the presentation by making it clear that the conceptual design as it is drawn in the Beaver Hunsaker corridor plan, the visual that I showed you just a few slides ago, the width of that does fit within the existing right-of-way of Hunsaker for the most part. Now, I want to clarify for anyone who doesn't know this, what I mean by right-of-way is, the right-of-way of the street, of the public right-of-way, doesn't always line up perfectly with the edges of the street, particularly in a case like Hunsaker, where there aren't existing sidewalks. Sometimes folks don't have an exact clear picture in their head of where their private property ends and where the public right-of-way begins, because there isn't necessarily a clear delineating point. It doesn't line up specifically with the edge of the roadway. And so there is going to be a handful of locations where the width required for the project kind of crosses over that right-of-way line and more into private property. That impact's going to be pretty minor. Along the corridor, we're only projecting 4 locations to have any impact of that nature at all. And we have strategies that we're going to be talking about in this presentation to reduce that potential impact as much as possible. So there's the outstanding design consideration of how we handle those locations where we just have a bit less right-of-way width on Hunsaker. And then also a spatial constraint that we have to consider is that there are some locations where we do have the right-of-way width, and but there's kind of a design challenge where if we went ahead and we took all of that right-of-way and we put in the conceptual design as it's drawn, it might have an impact on the length of people's driveways, where we might find ourselves in a position at certain properties. This isn't true for the entirety of the corridor, but specific properties do have shorter driveways. And if we're taking that additional right-of-way width, we might end up in a position where we're having parked cars conflict with the sidewalk. That image there is kind of intended to show you kind of what I mean when I say that. And so we're going to be working through how we mitigate that challenge as well. Because even if it's within the right-of-way, we certainly don't want to be creating conditions where pedestrians and parked cars are conflicting and people need to try moving around. That's not good to start with, and that's particularly difficult for people who use mobility devices such as wheelchairs to cope with. So we're working through how to mitigate that impact. And so bringing up this visual again of what the conceptual design looks like in these more challenging spatially constrained locations, what we're really at this stage thinking about and talking about is in front of those properties where we have those spatial constraints, whether it be a right-of-way width spatial constraint or whether that be a driveway-related spatial constraint, deleting the green space out of the conceptual design there and bending the sidewalk out to be curbside, that's going to give us, if we're talking about, just one side of the street having that kind of spatial constraint, and we take out one of those landscaping buffers, that's going to give us an additional 4 feet to work with. And keep in mind that at this point in time, the maximum projected impact to any property is 6 feet. So we would be taking it from 6 feet down to closer to 2 feet if we use this strategy. And this can certainly also be something that's really helpful for some of those tough driveways where there's already a bit of a shorter driveway in place, and we don't want to be kind of landing the sidewalk where it might be directly in line with a parked car. So using that same strategy of deleting the green space, bending the sidewalk out, and having it be curbside in those locations. So at this point in time, that's kind of how we're thinking through the subject of spatial constraints. As I mentioned, an additional design consideration that we're interested in facilitating feedback on is the subject of packaging in additional speed reduction features into the project, because there's just been such a prevalence of community comments about speeding. It's clearly something that's on people's minds. We are aware that Lane County reduced the speed limit on Hunsaker from, I believe it was 35 down to its current 25. And we've heard folks say that that does seem to be helping, but folks are still traveling above that posted speed limit. And there's
yes, they are.
yeah, and there's still certainly a lot of comments from folks about feeling uncomfortable, feeling unsafe due to the speeds of vehicles. So the city at this stage is considering expanding the scope of the project to include traffic calming. And in the context of Hunsaker, really what I'm talking about when I say traffic calming is speed cushions. That would be our kind of go-to standard treatment for a street like Hunsaker. Speed cushions, a lot of people would say it's a speed bump. It's really just an engineering term that describes what's in that image there. The city's standard engineering drawings for speed cushions, they go up about 3 inches high. So it's much more gentle than something you would see in, say, a grocery store parking lot, for example. And that's really because these installations are intended to accommodate higher speeds and higher volumes than a parking lot. So they're relatively gentle. They're good for reducing aggregate speeds. It's not the kind of installation that's going to completely prevent every single person from speeding, but we've had many projects where we've constructed speed cushions and they are effective for bringing down 85th percentile speeds and 50th percentile speeds. So we would just be kind of bringing down that aggregate and making the overall conditions more comfortable. And slowing those speeds kind of at an aggregate level. So that's something that we're considering. That certainly, is our standard treatment for speed reduction on a street like Hunsaker. Speed cushions are a bit different from speed humps in the sense that they have what I most often refer to as tire slots. So it's not continuous from one edge of the curb all the way over to the other edge of the curb. You see that the humps are kind of broken out into two sections in that visual there. Sometimes we'll straddle those tire slots across the center line of the street. In Hunsaker's case, my suspicion is we would probably do that. In some rare examples, we'll straddle it over the center of the general travel lanes. But either way, what those tire slots are really intended to do is mitigate travel time impact for emergency response vehicles. So they're spaced in a manner that allows things like fire trucks and ambulances to move through a corridor without travel time impact. And in the case of a street like Hunsaker, where it's such an essential part of reaching a lot of residential properties, it's likely that we would pursue speed cushions so that we could mitigate that potential emergency response time impact that might be associated with a different type of traffic calming device. And that being said, speed cushions are an option we're considering. We could look at other types of speed reduction features as well. Something that we sometimes hear community interest in is speed feedback signs. That seems to be something that folks have an interest in these days. We could consider packaging into the project. I think we may have some flexibility in getting a bit of additional funding that we could plug into speed reduction, a speed reduction component to the project. So that's something that we're certainly interested in hearing from folks about. And then I'll also say the third primary design consideration I'm going to highlight for you all, and hopefully folks will have comments on, is safe and comfortable pedestrian crossing conditions. And this is partially related to our last item about speed reduction, because if we're bringing the speeds down, that's something that's going to help people feel safer crossing the roadway. But also, we got to consider how we're treating marked crossings. I know some of you may be aware that Lane County has installed a marked crosswalk with what is referred to as an RRFB, which stands for Rectangular Rapid Flash Beacon. It's the type of crosswalk where you get up to the edge, you push the button, and then flashing yellow lights go off on the signposts to help visually indicate to drivers that a pedestrian is about to enter the crosswalk. So there is one of those at Hunsaker and Tato at this point. We, and when I say we, I mean the city of Eugene, in our project thus far have scoped a marked crosswalk at the intersection of Hunsaker and Summer Lane. And at the time that we put together the application for the grant, I believe we had just identified that as being a marked crosswalk, just paint. And so we're at a point now where we're asking ourselves, is that enough? Do we want to package in additional crossing enhancements into that intersection? Lane County has that RFB there. Is that something that people perceive to be working well? Is that something that we also want to see on Summer? So, that's another design consideration that we're working through. What do we do with that intersection? What level of improvement is appropriate, and what feels needed by neighbors in that area. So that's another thing that hopefully there will be feedback on from the community. And with that, I will kind of open it up for anyone who has questions or comments. I don't know, I saw some things ping in the chat. I don't know if those are questions for me. Kate, can I just kind of hand it over to you to facilitate whose questions go first?
Absolutely. I'll manage the queue for you and keep people in the room and at home all in line.
All right, great.
Okay, so first hand up was Patrick. Can you either come up and speak into the hoo-ha or I'll repeat it?
Hey, Logan, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Logan, in the package of this improvements, it's fully funded. Does that include all the drainage as far as parallel, and then down a little bit from Tato, the drainage that goes underneath that will have to be widened out? Is that included in the project as well?
Yeah, so we included funding for stormwater drainage improvements from Summer to Yvonne. And I'm not the best person to answer technical questions on exactly what we are going to do to those stormwater drainage facilities. But we have funding to improve those. And, keep in mind the way that water runs, it's not as though the benefit is just going to be curtailed to, Summer to Yvonne. It's going to help stormwater drainage conditions, from a broader area as well.
You were next. Logan, yeah.
Where's the speaker?
Just right there. You're in the right place. Yeah.
Just yell at it.
I have a bad back, so it hurts. Logan, can you hear me?
I can.
Janet Ayers, I'm here from Ward 7, but I'm interested in this work. I drive school bus for 4J and I frequently drive that, and thank you for considering the improvements that are needed. My question pertains to easements, with this being a county roadway with the city working in conjunction on this. The funding for this project of those on that roadway, I assume are county rather than city residents. Is that accurate?
Yeah, the properties that front Hunsaker, I believe, are all outside of city limits.
Okay, twofold question. With regard, will there be eminent domain applied with the sidewalk and the driveways that are currently there? The second part of that question pertains to easements, if easements will be assessed. And I fooled you. I've got a third question with the storm drainage that was mentioned, whether that storm drainage cost, if implemented on this roadway, will be assessed onto those residents at that along that location. Thank you.
So those costs will not be assessed to residents. I'm trying to remember your first question. I'm sorry. Was it about, were you getting at whether there's going to be annexation? Because I know that's a topic that's come up for folks.
It leads into that, yes. So I'll just simply put it right out there, as you said. Is this going to require annexation for the project? And whether or not those residents will be forced or asked to join the city, and has to do with easements possibly for the work being done there imposed on them, and then eminent domain. Your approach to dealing with those shortened driveways. Thank you.
Okay, so to get to the annexation question, no. So what we want to do is at the end of the project, when the portion of Hunsaker Lane that we're constructing has been brought up to the conceptual design, that's something similar to the conceptual design that was shown, the city of Eugene would like to do something that's called a jurisdictional transfer with Lane County. So we would like to come to a contractual agreement with Lane County where they transfer ownership of the roadway to the city of Eugene, at least the portion that we've improved. That does not include bringing the fronting properties into city limits. That just applies to the roadway. It doesn't have any implications for bringing folks into city limits. That's something, the city of Eugene, if you look on our webpage, on our website, annexation is is something that the city considers a voluntary process. It's something that people apply for, and I believe there's a relatively hefty fee to apply for. So it's certainly not something, nobody's going to be annexed into city limits against their will. And as far as eminent domain goes, that's not something that's going to play a role in this project. Like I said, the most that at this stage in the design process, the most I think it could potentially, the design that we're displaying could go over the right-of-way lines would potentially be 2 feet. And so we would probably, and we would need to work with individual homeowners to figure out what the best option is for how we handle that. I believe we would probably be able to come to an agreement with homeowners where we provide them with they voluntarily agree to allow us to compensate them for that property impact. So imminent domain wouldn't necessarily be something that we pursue. It's not the kind of situation where we plan on forcing the transfer of property over to us. I think I hit on all the questions.
Can I just make a comment?
Yep.
I'll just yell it.
Okay.
Bring on the speed bumps.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, I'll write that down.
Hi, Logan. My name is Andy Janisek, and I am curious why you haven't extended your project down to the new bike trail.
Yeah, so that's a good question. At the time that we applied for funding for this, because the way the transportation projects are funded, it takes a significant period of time to line it up. So we originally applied for this funding a couple of years ago. And at that point in time, the agreement we came to with Lane County is I believe that they only had funding to construct up to the point where at that point in time, they had funding to come up with a flexible delineator protected. So as some of you may remember, there were at one point in time, those flexible posts out on the roadway.
The fact that they're gone says everything if you're a biker.
Yeah, and I agree with you that them being knocked down and not being able to be replaced is an issue. But I will say, speaking to from a funding perspective, why the project wasn't originally scoped for being all the way to the path on Beaver, is because we had kind of broken that out as well. The city of Eugene is going to construct up to the conceptual design on this portion of Hunsaker, and then the county was going to have that flexible delineator protected walking, kind of like active transportation space to connect people over to the path. And so at this point in time, it's the kind of situation where the funding from the grant has already been scoped out, and we don't necessarily, it's not immediately clear to me that we're going to be able to extend the limits of that project that we have funded through that grant opportunity. It's something that we're evaluating whether there is a way for us to secure enough additional funding to do that. But at this point in time, I can't concretely answer the question of whether that's going to be possible for us. But I do hear what you're saying, and I do think, you know, we're gonna make the best effort we can to extend the project extents if that is possible.
Okay, over here.
Hi, Thad Ames. I live on Hunsaker, and so this really impacts me. And kind of to the point that was just asked was the need to extend that down to, is it Ross Lane? Because that's the majority. I know a lot of people bike, but that for the community is a big feeder to that path. So it seems odd to me that it stops at Tato, where a lot of the residents have walking areas around their area, their neighborhoods. But Ross Lane is where a lot of that walking and biking need is really prevalent. Is there, I mean, I don't know, I take that into consideration. And then also, like, when those, what were those white things called? That got put up. I don't know if they even talked to the community about those, but those were terrible, absolutely terrible for the residents that live there. And so, I mean, for people driving on them at 2 o'clock in the morning to just our neighborhood looking like crap for, you know, once it was all busted up, it was kind of odd that that wasn't brought up, because I could have told everyone that that road is, that those are just going to get destroyed, just based on how everybody drives on it.
Mm-hmm.
But the main question I came up here for actually was the intersection from River Road onto Hunsaker. Is that being kind of included in this to make that intersection safer?
So there's a separate project specific to the intersection of River Road and Hunsaker. They're working on a lot of safety improvements to that intersection. It's going to be the city's first protected, something that's referred to as a protected intersection. So it's gonna, and it's really hard to just describe without a visual, but it's going to include more separation for people of various modes. So it's going to reduce exposure of cyclists to vehicle traffic. And so we do have a lot of upcoming safety projects. I don't off the top of my head have a timeline for when that is being constructed. They're working through the engineering process of designing what exactly is going to go in there. But yes, there are going to be significant safety improvements at that intersection. And this project, when we have the buffered bike lanes constructed and the sidewalks constructed, is going to feed right into the active transportation improvements that are taking place at that intersection.
All right. Well, I haven't seen a lot of, thank God, a lot of pedestrian bicycle accidents there, but there's a lot of car accidents there. And so I was curious if they're updating the turning and signal to make it safer for people coming off of Hunsaker onto River Road South, or Irving onto Hunsaker as a resident that lives there.
Yeah, your audio broke up a little bit, but I think I got the gist of your question. To my knowledge, like signal refinements are something that are going to be discussed as a component of that project. Right now, where we are in the design process for that is really developing the engineering drawings for what type of like physical infrastructure is going to go in. So like, how are we going to design the curbs? You know, what kind of hardware do we need? So at this point in the process, it's really more about like drawing out what physical changes are going to happen. But to my knowledge, the subject of signalization and potential signal refinements and how we program those signals is absolutely something that's going to be really heavily discussed as a component of that project.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Logan, there's a question from the chat that says, if the city's planning to annex Hunsaker, they would like to see the city assume responsibility for the underground utilities as well. Can you address that?
So I think what they're referring to is the jurisdictional transfer of Hunsaker. So if Lane County and the city of Eugene came to an agreement and did a jurisdictional transfer for the portion of Hunsaker Lane that we improve, the city of Eugene would assume ownership and maintenance responsibilities for that roadway. And the underground utilities they're referencing, it's the kind of thing where I would need to have more detail on exactly what utilities are out there and what types of existing agreements might be in place. I can't necessarily specifically say that there would be city responsibility for all underground utilities. And I'm not saying that because it's not the case. I don't want to provide incorrect information without checking with the appropriate person first.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question here.
There seems to be a lot of projects in the works to take out landscaping and trees and replace it with concrete. And we're kind of in a critical time with the climate. So I'm just wondering what kind of, repercussions this is going to have on the ecology of the area.
Mm-hmm. So as you may have seen in the conceptual design image, the intent is on most places within the project area to have 4-foot landscaping planters on both sides of the street. And those are scoped to include street trees. Our urban foresters at the city of Eugene have a lot of experience with selecting appropriate species that do well in different planter sizes. So they're going to be able to provide us with some really great guidance to make sure that like healthy trees, healthy plants that can thrive in those environments are included in the project.
Where could I find the actual design document that shows, how many trees you're taking out, exactly what you plan to do? I mean, you're giving an overview, and I'm sure I hope there's details somewhere we can take a look at.
So the most detailed document that's available today is the Beaver Hunsaker corridor plan that you can find on Lane County's website. The stage that we're at right now is we are just about to start the process of developing the detailed engineering drawings that take that conceptual design, apply it to the corridor, and work through the things like some of the things we talked about, like spatial constraints. Do the sidewalks conflict with anything here? Do we need to like taper in the design at certain locations? And so as our engineers work on doing those engineering drawings in a program called AutoCAD, as they do that AutoCAD work, they're going to develop progressively more detailed engineering drawings that address some of those issues.
So will they do this detailed design after we sign on to agree to these changes, or will we have input after the details are made known?
I mean, there can be ongoing community engagement even as we're working on the engineering drawings. At this point in time, a lot of the sort of high-level community engagement has been done, and from here on out, it's going to be more of an instance where we're working with individual homeowners to kind of talk through the site-specific details of how the project may or may not interact with their property.
Well, I understand, and it's important to the people that are right next to it. It's also a community feel, a feel for the street. I hate to see things turned into concrete and the trees gone, or maybe baby trees replacing big trees, that kind of thing. And so I think it's important that everybody has a chance to, have a say.
Sure. Yeah, that's a valuable point. It's not something that's set in stone at this point. We can be flexible if the neighborhood association has an interest in talking through the specifics as we advance further into the design process, talking through the specifics of what's going to happen with street trees in the area. That's absolutely something that at a later point in time, myself or the engineering PM for the project can come back and provide an update on. And we can talk through exactly how that engineering process has gone and provide kind of a presentation on a variety of topics, like how we're addressing speed reduction, how we've handled street trees, for example. We could talk more about the stormwater drainage improvements. So we could absolutely, if it feels important to the neighborhood association, we could absolutely come back and provide an update and talk through how the engineering process is going.
I think that would be great. There's a question here about what exactly is the timeline and start date for the improvements?
Yeah, so at this point in time, I believe the projected schedule it's tentatively planned that construction would start next summer. It's possible that will get pushed back further. There is a lot of design work that needs to happen. And also, like many organizations, the city of Eugene is facing a bit of a staff shortage with engineers. But that is what was originally planned for. And so that's kind of the best answer I have at the moment.
And then I put myself in the queue and say, I think there's at least one heritage tree along that stretch. And how do you plan on maximizing preservation of trees that are, well over 100 years old and deserve that kind of treatment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're gonna need, we would need to look at the site-specific details. It's the kind of thing where we could try. I'm sorry, I'm hearing a lot of voices and I can't quite make out what anyone's saying.
We totally lost you there, so can you answer again?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry about that. What I was saying is, it kind of depends on the positioning of the tree and what the site-specific details are. We could try, depending on how it's positioned on the property, we could try using like how we route the sidewalk to mitigate impact. But once again, it's kind of a position where we need to look at exactly where it is, and figure out how it may or may not conflict with things like the bike lanes, the sidewalks, because something like the landscaping planter, we have a lot of flexibility in removing from the design and tapering it in, and we can kind of be flexible with how the sidewalk is routed. But when it comes to like the bike lane, it's really difficult to be flexible with how that's routed. We certainly wouldn't want to have any odd point where the bike lane just kind of falls off. That wouldn't feel safe or comfortable for folks. So it's the kind of thing where we're going to need to just look at the positioning of it and work through exactly how the best way for handling that.
Great. We have one more question here.
Logan, do you have yet an overlay of an aerial of what the right-of-way is and maybe how that might impact the existing neighbors?
Yeah.
Not where the improvements will go, but just where the overlay will show you what possible type impacts that might be?
Yeah, so Lane County has, as a component of the Beaver Hunsaker corridor plan, developed an aerial map that is roughly what you're describing.
We're hoping you're coming back.
Oh, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? I'm not sure if they can hear me.
I can hear you just fine, Logan.
Okay, I think I heard Kate say you guys got me back. Yeah, so Lane County has developed an aerial map that's roughly what you're describing. I think that, and I can share that with I could share that with Kate, and maybe she could distribute it to folks as she sees fit. But I think that something that I am going to talk with our project engineer about is whether we could hire someone to go out and put little like flag markers or something of that nature to more like directly show people where the right-of-way line is in front of their properties. Because the aerial map is helpful, but I feel like there's something to be said for like actually being on the ground and like seeing it in a non-overhead format. So I'm gonna talk with our engineer on the project about that and see if we can hire somebody to go out and physically put some kind of marker out to help people visualize exactly how far in the right-of-way line is on their front yard. And so yeah, that's kind of the approach that I'm thinking we're going to take. I can provide Kate with the documents that Lane County has compiled so far, and I'm gonna like I said, I'm gonna talk with our engineer about actually getting something out in the roadway that's going to help homeowners discuss the subject with us and understand exactly where the right-of-way line is on their property.
Great. Are there any other questions for Logan? Oh, here's another one. Just, oh. Did you want to know? No.
I'm gonna have to leave.
Okay.
I want a real quick follow-up for the next presentation.
Logan, along with that overlay, the aerial overlay with those homes that would be impacted with the road frontage, so to speak, could you provide some answers, checking with your people, the city, I guess, with regard to that question asked earlier by another individual here about the underground utilities, and which are serviced by city as a county? So there's some idea. And where this could, what the future plans are with the city with regard to that, adding or forcing or causing additional service fees, whatever, for folks when we're probably facing a pretty rough economic time nationally. So keeping that in mind. So simply asking you for that question to be answered by that person who asked that question earlier. Thank you.
Sure. Absolutely.
And there's one more comment in the chat, Logan, for you. If you do have to take out a heritage tree, would we get to know about it beforehand?
Sure. I mean, since you're asking, absolutely. You know, like I said, we can come back. We could provide the neighborhood association with an update, and since there's been a strong interest shown in street trees, we can absolutely keep you very in the loop on the status of that.
Great. Anything else for Logan? All right. Thank you very much. We appreciate your being here tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Okay.
Thanks, Logan.